Students, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you are also able to see my screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what did you observe in this video? There was some blatant discrimination that was going on, right? And uh, this student from MIT, she was not recognized by the face recognition software. Okay, while white-skinned people were easily getting recognized, dark-skinned people like her were not getting recognized by this particular facial recognition system. Okay, that was the main idea. And then she also noted that when she puts a white mask on her face, the face gets detected. So, like inevitably, there is something wrong that is going on in the whole system. And after she found this, she actually worked with one of her colleagues from Google, and they together wrote this very interesting paper, which has been from then onward very heavily cited in the fairness literature. And the name of the paper actually starts as Gender Shades, Intersectional Accuracy, Disparities in Commercial Gender Classification. So this paper was written by Joy Bulamwini and Timnit Gebru. So they too actually set off after this experience that Joy had with this facial recognition system. They came up with this very interesting research problem where they studied two things. One are some benchmark data sets and two, some commercial face recognition systems that identify gender from the facial image. Okay, so these are the two things, two interesting things that they tried to investigate in this paper. And this entire paper or this entire research problem was motivated by the experience that Joy shared in the video that I showed you just now. Okay. So now what are the problems? What are the caveats of each of this? The benchmark datasets as well as the facial recognition softwares. Okay, so these caveats, if any, need to be systematically studied And this paper that we are going to look through is all about systematically studying, or what we call, last day also I talked about this, auditing. Okay, and here you are auditing two things. One is the benchmark dataset. Benchmark dataset for gender classification, and the facial recognition systems that can detect gender. Okay, now the point here is this word gender. So what do you think? Like, what should be the structure of gender? Is it binary? What is your take on this? Any thoughts?
It's not binary.
Yeah, so it's, let's look at the normative. So if it is normative, people typically tend to believe or think that gender is binary with two categories, male and female. However, the categorization of gender is much, much more complex than this. Okay. And in general, it has been now well established in sociology that gender is a non-binary attribute. However, most commercial systems actually treat gender to be a binary item, okay, or a binary attribute. And therefore, the authors in this paper had to restrict their analysis to a binary representation of gender. Okay. So now, therefore, we have got one important point, that gender in this paper, gender is assumed to be binary. Okay, for their analysis. Now, the next thing is skin type. Okay, or the phenotypic classification of skin color. Now, here they, the authors, again resorted to a binary distinction, dark versus light. Actually, the authors did a little bit more. We will talk in details about that. But for the time being, assume that the phenotypic classification is broadly divided into two parts, dark and light. Okay. So we have seen the structure of gender to be used. We have seen the structure of skin type to be used in this analysis. Now the third and the most important part. So what do you think an intersectional group refers to? The clue lies in points 1 and 2. What do you think are intersectional groups? So in the paper, it is introduced at different places, but I'm trying to organize it a little bit more so that it becomes easy for you to follow and remember. So the intersectional groups are the mix and match of these two attributes: gender, skin type. So you have male, female, light, dark. So basically, the intersectional groups are lighter males, lighter females, darker males, darker females. And all their study would be around these four broad intersectional groups. So the entire audit that they performed was around these four intersectional groups. Now, with this introduction, we can move forward to the benchmark datasets. Okay, before that, let me, okay, let us do it later. So first, let us talk about the intersectional or the benchmark datasets. So when the authors started off this study, they found that there are not many very good data sets, benchmark data sets on which such experiments of gender classification could be run. Okay. So one data set that they found was very relevant was the IJBA dataset released by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Now, why was this dataset significant? This dataset actually consisted of facial images of government officials. Okay, so there was involvement of the government in this dataset, and therefore this dataset was something that the authors felt would be a good benchmark. And the time of assessment was between April to May 2017. And at this time, there were 500 unique subjects in this data set. Okay. So there were 500 unique subjects in this particular data set. So this was the first benchmark that the authors thought would be useful for their experiments. The second benchmark was the Adians dataset. It is a standard gender classification dataset. And this dataset was released in 2014. So it has around 2284 unique individual subject images. But out of this, only 2194 are properly discernible. Therefore, the authors went on with this number of unique individual images for their experiment. So now you have the data sets, the two benchmark data sets that the authors used. You also have the intersectional groups against which the data has to be tested. Now, what is required? Required is that none of these data sets are annotated or were annotated with skin types. Now, the question is, how do we go about doing this skin type categorization? Okay, so to do this, the authors used the very well known, so this is one of the most standard methods of skin type classification, the Fitzpatrick scale of skin type classification. This has 6 classification standards. Okay, the skin type is classified into 6 different standards. So I'll show you an example. So these are the 6 types. So the first one is pale white skin, the second one is fair skin, then the darker white skin, then the light brown skin, and dark brown or black skin. So examples are somewhat like this. Okay, so these were the 6 different categories in which the facial images of the two data sets need to be classified into. Okay, so this was one task. So task one was to classify each unique image into one of the six skin types. And what is task 2? What is task 2? These are annotation tasks. I'm talking about annotation task.
Gender annotation.
Yes. Task 2 is annotation of the gender. Okay. So the first task is to classify each unique image into one of the six skin types. And the second annotation task is the annotation of the gender. So for the first data set, the IJBA data set, the skin type as well as the gender annotation was done by one of the authors. Okay. For the other data set, since it is already a gender classification dataset standard, so gender was already annotated. And the skin type was again annotated by one of the authors. Fine. So this is how they did the annotations of the two benchmark datasets. Now, in order to actually like uh, mm, have a little larger granularity of the analysis, the skin types were divided into two broad types, as I told you earlier. Two broad types where they had 1, 2, and 3. These three skin types that I showed you, they aggregated them into light. Okay. And 4, 5, and 6 was aggregated into dark. Okay. Otherwise, the number of samples that they had was like too small to have 6 fine categories. Okay. So that's why they combined the first 3 into lighter tone and the last 3 skin types into the darker tone. Okay. So then they did some preliminary analysis, and the preliminary analysis resulted in a very striking observation. The observation was that the skin types were not properly distributed, were or not evenly distributed, okay, in any of these benchmark data sets. We will look into the results in the next day's lecture, but for the time being, just believe me that the skin type distribution, even if you consider only two skin types, the light and the dark, the skin type distribution was not even in any of the data sets. Was in fact highly skewed. Therefore, all the studies that they would be planning to do would become futile because the basic skin type distribution, if that is not even in the dataset, then all the results that you are going to present later are going to be biased anyway. So that's why they introduced a third benchmark. This is a benchmark that they contributed to the community. Okay, so they introduced their own benchmark, which they called PPB, which stands for Pilot Parliaments Benchmark. Now, as the name itself suggests, the authors chose pictures of parliamentarians to build this dataset. Okay. Now, they had to choose some countries from where they would pick up parliamentarians. So, for their study, they choose the following countries: Rwanda, Senegal, South Africa, and Iceland, Finland, and Sweden. I hope you are already getting like why they chose these two subsets. So this is their hope was, or their hypothesis was, that this would represent, this set would dominate darker skin types, while this one would dominate lighter skin types. In total, they chose 1270 unique individuals across these 6 countries. Now, you might ask that why parliamentarian data? So, the parliamentarian data was chosen because of its non-restrictive licenses, which allowed the authors to use it freely for their experimental purposes. Okay, so that was the reason why they used parliamentarian data. Now, the second question is why these 6 countries? Okay, so these 6 countries were chosen based on their highest gender parity. So the ratio of males to females is best in these countries. Okay, if you rank them based on the interparliamentary union ranking, so this is a ranking that is followed across all the parliaments across the globe. Okay, so if you rank all these parliamentarians across all these different countries, okay, you find the best gender parity in these 6 countries. Okay, for the darker countries, these are the top 3 countries, with Rwanda being the best in gender parity. Okay, and similarly on the lighter skin, these 3 countries show the best gender parity, and that's why these 6 countries were chosen for the experiments that the authors were to do. Okay, so tomorrow we will talk about the overall annotation that the authors did on this new benchmark that they introduced, and then we will study the different biases in these benchmark datasets as well as in the commercial softwares. So we'll stop here. Any questions? Any questions? No? So we'll stop here and see you tomorrow. Hopefully we'll finish this tomorrow.
So, so